You guys alive?
Sort of.
Sort of. Sort of. That's the best you can hope for today. Have you guys gone and gotten your tests done, your COVID tests?
Not yet.
You should do it, Olivia. We got an email yesterday, basically from Joe Garcia, who is running the whole COVID response thing, among other things that he does as part of his job. The college was going to be offering optional testing at the beginning of next week for COVID. So you could get a COVID test before you went home and spread COVID to all of your relatives over Thanksgiving. But after the increase in positive COVID tests that occurred last week that resulted us moving to online only classes for a short period of time, they have asked that everyone get tested. So rather than optional testing, they really want to make it, they haven't used the word mandatory, I don't think, but that's kind of the impression that I get from the wording of the emails. So anyway, free testing at the Maybe Center. There's an email that went out to everybody that has a link to schedule a time. I think they're only allowing 25 people in per every half-hour block. So go get your test. It's going on this week. I'm not sure how many days they're going to be doing it, but there were only 497 people who had signed up as of yesterday. So get that done, and then at least you'll know if you're positive or not, unless you've been tested recently for some other reason. For example, you're a football player who gets tested periodically, and I think they all underwent tests recently because of an outbreak among football players. So so do that. We have another little more than a week and a half, and then we'll all be going away for Thanksgiving. And better to know your status now than to find out later after family members and things get sick. So I was not asked to make that plug by the administration. I just think it's a smart thing to do. Unfortunately, they've changed the system for that. Now you can put your phone number in there and they will notify you by text. So at 8 o'clock last night, I got a text from the testing agency that made my heart skip a beat, but it was just a text telling me that my sample had arrived at the testing facility. So I have not gotten my result back yet, but we will see. I need to reconfigure my mind into expecting just keeping you informed texts from the testing firm that the college has contracted with. So if your anxiety isn't high enough, go get tested and then get a bunch of texts on your phone telling you about the progress of your test as it goes through the system, to add to the anxiety of the fact that you have a test in this class on Friday. Up in the ante on anxiety. About the test on Friday, a number of people are not able to meet in person. After the last test, there were some test-taking difficulties that some people experienced with the electronic forms of the test. So I was actually contemplating just saying, do you guys want to just take the test in person on Friday? But things have changed since then, and virtually all of us can't really be here for that. If you are here on campus and are allowed to interact with humans and you would rather take the test in person on paper, let me know and we can arrange that, because there's a room scheduled for us anyway. Otherwise, we'll continue testing procedures as we have in the past. If you're using a PDF annotator that is free and as a result of that covers up portions of your answers, that is a less productive way of taking the test than using a different annotator that doesn't do that. If you are using one of those programs that does cover up your answers with advertisements for the free PDF annotating program. Just keep that in mind as you answer, and don't write too near any of the margins on the exam, because that just makes it difficult for me to grade the test if part of your test answers are covered up with stupid corporate logos. That is all I have. Oh, there's an exam review sheet up on Moodle, and there is last year's exam 3 test that will give you some idea of the types of questions that I tend to ask, and also kind of what their form is. So you have the review sheet, you have an example of an old exam. Use those to help you prepare. Also, feel free to let me know if you have any questions. The other thing is, last time we did a review session, not a ton of people came, but I'm willing to do that again if you would find that productive. Just let me know of a time. Questions? The topics covered are on the review sheet, and they extend from last test to this test. And so the first thing we did after the last test was the food web exercise that we met in person for, and talking about food webs at Polyface Farm and the Naylor Farm. And it extends all the way up until today, which should be the conclusion of our coverage of history and economics. Questions? All right. Then here we go. Give me a minute. I'm straightening out things in stupid Zoom. All right. Okay, can you guys see the PowerPoint presentation? Okay. All right. So we had kind of gotten to the end of World War II, and we had talked about the fact that World War II had a number of effects. And among these effects were that we had massive increases in manufacturing capacity in the United States as a result of World War II, the ramping up of manufacturing to supply the war effort with planes, tanks, jeeps, et cetera, battleships. And after World War II, all of that productivity, all that manufacturing productivity got repurposed, and instead of building planes and tanks and things like this, after World War II was over, a certain proportion of that manufacturing capacity got repurposed to build automobiles, build tractors, build combines, et cetera. And this manufacturing capacity actually kind of fueled a post-war economic boom that basically raised the standard of living for the vast majority of Americans. And so there was this kind of post-war period where everybody was pretty happy. They were scared to death of the Russians because of the Cold War, but everybody was pretty happy and pretty economically satisfied during the 50s and 60s, at least until the late 60s, because the United States kind of reaped the benefits of having won the war and having altered American society in such a way that it really opened up a lot of economic opportunity. So manufacturing capacity is one thing. But the other thing that happened was the GI Bill was a way in which the US government showed its gratitude to service people who had served in World War II. And what they did was they offered to basically pay for those veterans to go to college and get a college degree, which most of them would not have been capable of affording prior to that. Given that at this time, the majority of the country was rural, the majority of those people who fought in World War II were also from rural communities. And so when these generally men went off to college, they tended to go to agricultural schools, and they tended to study things like agriculture, agronomy, things that would then allow them to go back to their family farms and go to work, being the farmers that they were going to be before they went off to World War II. And so, coupled with increased manufacturing capacity and increases in the availability of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, because once again of ramping up of manufacturing capacity of nitrogen fixation during the war, that got coupled with a highly educated group of farmers coming out of these colleges after World War II. And so during this time, you saw a lot of increase in farm productivity simply because farmers were doing their farming better. They did it with more knowledge, more science applied to farming. They did it with more mechanization, and they did it with more fertilizer. And so one of the things that you see in that report, that Dimitri et al. U.S. Department of Agriculture report, is you see that farms are growing more productive over the course of time. We looked at enrollment rates in U.S. colleges and universities, and graduation rates are both going up after World War II. And what this figure is here, this is a figure showing the size of farms, or the total amount of land that is actually being farmed. And in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, the amount of acreage that was being farmed was going up, and then it declined over time through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and into the 60s. But then after 1971 here, you see that the amount of acreage begins to climb again. And so this increase in farming acreage during the late 1800s and early 1900s is due essentially to westward expansion. People moving out into the Midwest, in many cases, the U.S. government and well, it was mainly the U.S. government. The U.S. government incentivized moving west by offering people tracts of land that were theirs, generally for free, if they agreed to, for example, pick up stakes and leave Pennsylvania and move to, for example, the Oklahoma Territory. If you've ever seen anything about the Oklahoma land rush, there was a time period where you could go and stake your claim to land in Oklahoma, literally by riding out into Oklahoma after they opened the border and literally driving a stake in a plot of land and laying claim to that. And so you see this increase in acreage being farmed because of the increasing population size of the United States and this move into what would later become the Western states. You saw a decline during the Great Depression and into World War II, simply because of the economic impacts of the Great Depression, the fact that the Dust Bowl occurred during the Great Depression, and then during World War II, the number of acres planted got smaller simply because there were fewer farmers doing that activity. And then when those farmers came back, many of those farmers actually didn't come back and go immediately to the farm. They went to colleges and universities. In some cases, they went into manufacturing jobs that were created by the war. And so you saw this decrease in acreage farming. But then in 1971, you began to see that decrease in the amount of acreage farmed begin to go up. And during all of this, what you're seeing is the productivity per acre was relatively flat up until the end of the Great Depression, began to increase somewhat in the 1940s and into the 50s. And since the 1950s, mid-1950s, productivity in terms of the number of bushels per acre that are yielded has just been increasing dramatically. And once again, this is due to a combination of better farming practices, more usage of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and the introduction of mechanization on farms, which are all things that we've talked about repeatedly now. So during this time, the ever normal granary is functioning. And so farm productivity is going way up. And each year, the federal government is taking farmers' crops in return for loans that they receive to do business, because productivity is going up, and as productivity goes up, the price of the commodities that the farmers are growing is going down. And so their choice is to sell their grain on the open market at a really low price, or just pay back the loan in terms of the crop. And that grain is being stored over time, so that by the time you get to the Kennedy administration, the federal government is beginning to have a problem with all of this grain that they are storing. So the ever normal granary, illustrated here in an editorial cartoon, is basically so full that it's just becoming expensive to maintain storage facilities for all of this grain that is being stored in the event that we someday enter a period of time when agricultural productivity is low, and then this grain can be released back onto the market. It's odd that there would be editorial cartoons about the ever normal granary and the problems that the ever normal granary is causing, because my guess is most of you had never even heard of the ever normal granary prior to me introducing you to the idea in this class. Is that correct? Yeah, Mary's like, I had no idea. So what happened in 1972 is, I mentioned last time, there was a drought in Russia. We're in the middle of the Cold War. Relationships between Russia and China and the United States are very chilly because we're the major nuclear powers, and we don't agree on what the balance of power globally should be. And Nixon wants to try and thaw these relationships. So one of the things that Nixon was famous for was to beginning to make inroads into China and thawing that relationship. And during this drought in Russia, where their agricultural productivity was falling off, Nixon also viewed this as an opportunity for him to once again start thawing international relations, making the world a little safer by reducing the chance of nuclear war. And so Earl Butz, who is mentioned in Poland's book, had this idea that one of the ways that we could kind of offer an olive branch to Russia that wouldn't require us to do anything militarily, wouldn't require us to reduce the number of nuclear arms that we had or anything else, but one olive branch that we could offer them is we could help them out with their agriculture issue. Because we had a problem ourselves in the United States that the ever normal granary is getting too large, too cumbersome, too expensive to maintain. We have all of this surplus agricultural commodity laying around, and Russia badly needs that. And so in 1972, the federal government basically sold off the ever normal granary to Russia, cleaned it out, just got rid of all of it. Billions of dollars came into the federal coffers, and all of the grain in the ever normal granary went to Russia. And this wouldn't have been a problem, except that the next year, 1973, we experienced a drought in the United States, and our agricultural productivity went down drastically. And because we didn't have the stocks that we had just the year previous, all of a sudden prices for food began to skyrocket. Huge inflation during 1973 that was driven largely by inflation in food prices. It got so bad that mothers marched on Washington demanding the government to do something about rising food prices. And the government did do something about rising food prices. And the thing that they did was in 1974, once again, under Earl Butz's direction, they changed the way the federal government basically subsidizes agriculture. So the way that they subsidize agriculture as a result of the New Deal was this process of offering loans to farmers to fund their next year's crop. The crop was collateral. If the bottom fell out of the market for their product in terms of price because there was too much productivity, the farmer could either sell their grain on the open market at a reduced price, or they could just offer up that grain back to the government as repayment of the loan. And this is how we got these big stores of grain that became known as the ever normal granary. But in 1974, they changed this system, and the system became a system in which every 5 years there is an agricultural they call it the food bill, but it's an agriculture bill that funds the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 5-year blocks. And in these bills, if you go and read them, and I've read a number of them every year that they come out, and they don't come out anymore on the set 5-year schedule because Congress is fairly dysfunctional. But they come out every 5 to 8 years, depending on kind of how dysfunctional Congress is. But in these farm bills, basically portions of the farm bill set floor prices for commodities. So there will be a floor price for corn. There will be a floor price for soybeans. And those floor prices are floor prices that stay in effect for 5-year increments. And then they rewrite the food bill and they alter those floor prices depending on kind of on what's going on with productivity and agricultural markets and things like this. And the purpose of this floor price is, let's say that the floor price for corn is $1.75 per bushel. If you're having a good agricultural year, what the floor price basically says is if there's a lot of productivity and the price of a bushel of corn falls below that price, let's say that it falls to $1.65 per bushel. What the government then will do is for every bushel that you have to sell at $1.65, the federal government will give you a direct payment of 10 cents for each of those bushels to bring your price of your corn back up to this $1.75 level. If you have a low productivity year and the price of corn starts to creep up and now your corn is at $2 a bushel, the government does nothing because each bushel of corn is above this floor price. You're making more than the floor price. And so once your commodity is above that floor price, the government isn't required to do anything to subsidize you. You just sell it at that higher price, and presumably you make more money because you're getting more money for your grain. And so this way of making direct payments to farmers to basically subsidize the difference between what the market value of your crop is versus what this floor price is, basically kind of changed the way farming operated. Normally, if you are a farmer, you want to have a decent enough price per bushel so that you can make back the money that you spent to plant that crop and also have some profit to pour into the farm for future years and to pay your employees and things like this. During good years, agricultural productivity is high, price goes down, and then it becomes more difficult to do that. But in this system, if agriculture is being funded this way, and it continues to be funded this way to this day, what's the easiest way to make more money as a farmer? Keep in mind that price fluctuates with the supply of corn in this case, because food has an inelastic demand curve. So if it doesn't matter what the market price is for a bushel of corn, because the government will make up whatever the difference is between the market price and the floor price. So this is the floor price. This is the market price under a good productive agricultural year. This is the market price under a poorer, lower productivity year. If the government is going to pay you the difference between market price and floor price, what does it behoove you to do as a farmer if your goal is to just make more money?
Produce more.
Just produce more. It doesn't really matter if you're flooding the market with corn. The way you make more money is to produce more bushels of corn. And as you strive to produce more bushels of corn, it doesn't matter that you're flooding the market, because if you flood the market with corn and the price falls to $1.50, instead of the government paying you 10 cents per bushel, the government's now going to pay you 25 cents per bushel. If the price falls to $1 per bushel because there's so much corn on the market, the government's just not going to pay you 25 cents a bushel, and will now pay you 75 cents per bushel. So the way to make money farming under this system of subsidizing agriculture is to produce more bushels. How do you go about producing more bushels of corn? How are you going to make
Having
more
a
bushels?
bigger farm.
Yeah, just plant more acres. And so one of the things that you'll see is that right there in the 1960s, but especially moving into the 1970s, you see this shift from lots of small farms to a fewer number of larger farms. What Earl Butz told farmers in 1974, and this is once again in the Omnivore's Dilemma, is he's famous for having said this. He said, "Get big or get out." And so farmers tore down their fences. They planted fence row to fence row. If you go out of town from Liberty, go down to Highway 210 and head out Highway 210 towards Orick, you will see a bunch of farm and soybean fields down there in the river bottoms. And one of the things that you will notice is there's not a fence in sight, because they've planted every little scrap of agricultural land that you can plant. They plant right up to the ditches that are right next to the highway. No fences anymore. They plant fence row to fence row. And they took Earl Butz's admonition that if you want to survive in this farm economy, what you have to do is you have to be planting more acres, because more acres yields more bushels, and having more bushels is the way that you get more income. Because it doesn't matter how much you produce, the government is always going to make up the difference between the floor price and the market price. And this, as much as anything else, has led to the decline of the family farm. It was already declining to begin with, but with the rise of mechanization, where a single individual can effectively farm 2,000 acres by himself, to the need to farm large plots of land because of the way agriculture gets funded now, those two things have basically led to farms getting bigger and bigger, and as a result of those farms getting bigger and bigger, there are fewer and fewer of those farms. So that was the end of the ever normal granary, and this is now how we subsidize things. But the kinds of things that we subsidize are interesting. We tend to subsidize commodity crops in the United States. So once again, if you go to the US Department of Agriculture, they ironically enough have two things that they do. There are lots of things that the Department of Agriculture does, but with regard to food supply, there are two things they do that seem to me to be diametrically opposed to one another. One of the things that they do is they run the subsidy program that encourages farmers to grow different types of crops. And in the top frame here, you can see in the top pie chart, you see the distribution of food subsidies. I think this was based on 2018 data, but it hasn't really changed much. And what you see is that most of the money that is paid out in subsidies to farmers goes into grains and protein. It's basically corn and wheat and rice and soybeans. This is what the government spends most of its money subsidizing. Dairy is the next biggest thing, and fruits and vegetables are so small you can't even make them out in the pie chart in terms of proportion of the US Department of Agriculture subsidy budget that goes into subsidizing agriculture. Every year they publish a report on agricultural subsidy expenditures, and so you can go every year and look at this, and you'll see that hasn't really changed that much over the last decade. However, they also publish the USDA dietary recommendations. And what they recommend is that you eat a lot of vegetables, you eat a lot of fruits, you drink a lot of dairy, and you limit your intake of grains and protein. And that protein could be in the form of beans, but that protein in this case is also in the form of meat. And so let's put on your critical thinking caps for a minute and look at these two figures. Does this seem like a reasonable subsidy structure for funding agriculture given what the USDA itself recommends in terms of what you should eat? Olivia, why not?
They don't match up at all, really.
They don't match up at all. Have you ever gone to the store and bought fruits and vegetables and noticed anything about the price of fruits and vegetables?
Yeah, it's way more expensive to eat healthy than crappy.
Oh my God, it is so much more expensive to eat a healthy diet than to eat a crummy diet. This is why it's so much harder to eat a healthy diet than a crummy diet, because things that are healthy for you are not heavily subsidized by the federal government. Grains and protein are subsidized by the federal government, fruits and vegetables are not. So it must be weird, or maybe it's not weird because it's probably different parts of the Department of Agriculture, but as an agency, it must, if an agency had emotions, I can imagine a certain amount of cognitive dissonance in the Department of Agriculture. This is what we say you should be eating in this lower panel, and this is what we're telling farmers to grow. Imagine if there was a floor price for oranges and spinach and broccoli, such that if you flooded the market with spinach and broccoli and the price dropped out of it, the government would make up the difference between the market price and the floor price. You would see a bunch of people probably going into spinach and broccoli farming, because that's where the subsidies come from. These subsidies come from not telling farmers what to plant, but it's basically a subsidy structure that says we have floor prices established for these types of crops. So if you produce a lot of these and that drives down the price, we're going to make up the difference between the floor price and the market price. And they do that for grains and in this case, soybeans for the most part, but they don't do that for fruits and vegetables. Questions about the history of the 20th century and economics? This brings us up to the current day. One of the things that you will notice in the supermarket right now is that food prices are relatively high. And one of the reasons that food prices are relatively high is that we went through a tremendous flood last year in the Midwest. And so agricultural productivity last year was relatively low, and that has driven up food prices. In 2014, that's when the US government's requirements to mix more grain-based ethanol into gasoline went into effect. And that was also a time period when the United States was experiencing a drought in the Midwest. And so there was a time period back then when food prices also went up, but that was mainly a supply issue driven by lower productivity due to a weather event combined with increased demand, because automotive fuel providers were being required to mix in at least 10% ethanol into gasoline. Once again, that was an agricultural program that was designed to take corn off of the market and boost the price of corn so that the government didn't have to keep paying out huge subsidies to farmers. If there's another market for corn, the production of grain ethanol, which then goes into gasoline, then the price of corn goes up, and then these payments that the government has to make up the difference between the market price and the floor price, those payments either diminish in size or they go away altogether. The effect of that program was basically that it drove up prices for the consumer at the supermarket, because now there was decreased supply in the face of increased demand, and those two things interacting drove up the price. But the ethanol issue brings up the the last thing that I want to talk to you about before the end of test 3 material. Those of you in business and economics, have you heard of a economic law called Say's law? I think I've mentioned it once or twice, but we haven't really talked about it in detail. Anybody ever heard of Say's law?
I haven't.
Okay, it's also mentioned in the chapter that deals with Earl Butts, the sage of Purdue, the plague of cheap corn. It's actually in the section called the plague of cheap corn. Breaking out my copy. So chapter 2, section 5 on page 47 of the Omnivore's Dilemma talks about the plague of cheap corn. And I believe Say's law is mentioned in here. Well, now I don't see it. Well, anyway, what Say's law basically says that the quickest, easiest, quippiest way of saying Say's law is supply creates its own demand. And what this basically means economically is that if you have a resource that is in high supply, what you will oftentimes find people doing is they will find other uses for that resource simply because it's really cheap, because it is in high supply and there's very little demand for it. So whenever something is cheaply available, it will create its own demand because people will say, oh, there's that thing that's really cheap to buy. What use can I put that thing to? And so in the case of corn, as corn has become cheaper and cheaper because there are government funded incentives to grow a lot of corn, what you have found is that the first thing people started doing is they started refining this corn into high fructose corn syrup. If you look up the history of high fructose corn syrup, you don't find it becoming widely incorporated into food that you didn't find it in prior to this until the mid-1970s. If you pick up a loaf of bread, next time you go to the supermarket, pick up a loaf of bread and look at the ingredients. One of the things that you will find surprising if you make your own bread at home is there's an ingredient in modern bread that is not in bread that you make at your house and was not in bread prior to the mid-1970s. What is that substance that you find in bread that you used to not find in bread? High fructose corn syrup. You will find it in most breads that you can commercially buy on the market. I make my bread at home when I have the time to do it, and none of the bread recipes that I use call for high fructose corn syrup. Why would you add high fructose corn syrup to bread? Bread is basically water, flour, yeast, salt. Why would you add high fructose corn syrup to bread? Anybody?
things
I
easier
could
to
sit
blend?
here all day long. Branson,
Does it make things easier to blend?
it doesn't. And kneading dough actually turns out to be a pretty easy process. We haven't yet talked in here about the evolutionary basis of sensory perception in humans, have we? Mary's like, no. Olivia's no, we have not. Okay, imagine that you're a hunter-gatherer. You're a Western African bushman, and you spend all of your time wandering around the environment looking for food, and your food mainly is made up of insects and plant material that you are hunting and gathering. Plant material is notoriously hard to digest because it's got all of the stuff that's inside of it that you want, and it's encapsulated in cellulose, which you don't have the enzymes to break down, and protein in the form of insects and other small animals that you might find and eat is just in relatively short supply. But what else is in short supply that you need a certain amount of every day in order to survive?
Isn't it like fats?
Not so much fats, but another class of compounds. You're going to get fats anytime you eat an animal. And we don't really need a supply of fat as much as we need another supply.
Protein?
We need less protein than we need this other thing. This makes up most of our caloric intake.
Carbohydrates.
Carbohydrates. So when you're a hunter-gatherer, you're getting probably enough protein, enough fats and things like that. But the plant material that you take in, because a lot of that plant material has carbohydrates in it, but those carbohydrates are inside of cells that are protected by cellulose, it turns out getting those carbohydrates out as a human is relatively inefficient. Have you guys ever heard of honeypot ants?
No.
Nope, honeypot ants. Give me a minute. I'm going to go and find honeypot ants for you. Can you guys see my web browser? No. Okay. All right.
I can.
Let's see. See my web browser now? Okay. Here are images of honeypot ants. They don't occur here in the United States, but it's an ant, and the abdomen of the ant is filled with essentially sugar water. And one of the things that you'll find with hunter-gatherer cultures in Southern Africa and in Australia, which is where these types of ants tend to live, different species, but all in this group of ants that tend to have this characteristic. What happens in the colony is these ants hang from the ceiling of the colony, and basically they excrete sugar water that feeds the other ants. And when a group of hunter-gatherers comes across a honeypot ant colony, they will break open that colony and they will pick up these ants and they will just pop the abdomen into their mouth, pop the abdomen off, throw the head and thorax away, and they will basically just devour the colony of honeypot ants. And the reason for this is that the life of a hunter-gatherer doesn't come into contact with highly concentrated, easily digestible carbohydrates very often. And so as a hunter-gatherer, the response that you have when you taste something sweet is that you like it. And as a result of you liking it, you eat a lot of it because that gives you a boost in terms of your caloric intake that is very easy to access, because the honeypot ants have kind of already done the job of extracting the sugar from whatever they've been eating, and they've concentrated it in their abdomens. So when you're a hunter-gatherer and you're living on a low carbohydrate diet, high protein diet, when you do come into carbohydrate abundance, your tendency is going to just eat the hell out of that stuff, to the point that we've evolved a taste profile on our tongues that basically predisposes us to eat sweet things. So is there something about the structure of a sugar molecule that makes it inherently sweet? Or are sugar molecules sweet to the taste because our brain interprets sweetness? Another way of asking this, is there something inherently bitter about substances that are poisonous? Or is it that our brain interprets those substances as bitter? Which do you think is the case?
I'm guessing it's psychological primarily.
It's psychological. So there are good evolutionary reasons why over evolutionary time, human brains would have evolved to interpret dangerous things as bad tasting and things that we want to be taking in as good tasting. So there's nothing inherent in the structure of a molecule of sugar that should make it sweet for all organisms, but our brains have evolved such that we interpret sweet things as good, and as a result, we have this positive neurological response to sweet things. Pop almonds that still have the skin on them into your mouth, and they will taste bitter to you. Well, it turns out that in the skins of almonds is cyanide. So one of the reasons I don't like almonds is because they smell like cyanide, and I always think somebody's trying to kill me. If you ever, I think I may have mentioned this before, maybe it wasn't in this class. If your significant other ever offers you as a gift an almond containing dish that he or she has never prepared for you, don't eat it. Because if there's cyanide in it, you'll never smell it coming because it will be masked by the smell of almonds. Not to make you too paranoid, but I was in Peru. I picked up a millipede in the forest when I was living in Peru back in 1996. And when I picked up the millipede, it's a heavily armored millipede, but when I picked it up, I could smell in the palm of my hand, I could smell the strong scent of almonds. And it turns out it's one of those species of millipedes that excretes cyanide as a chemical defense to keep it from being preyed upon. And then when I picked it up and I poked at it, I saw these little streams squirt out of these joints of the legs, where as I poked on it, it basically contracted a muscle in there and squirted out this little stream of cyanide-containing fluid. So our brains have evolved to interpret certain stimuli in certain ways, based largely on the fact of whether that stuff is good for us or bad for us. And what our brains have told us over evolutionary time is sweet stuff is good for you. And that works if you're a hunter-gatherer where you don't come across sweet stuff very often out in nature. Because when you run into a colony of honeypot ants, your body, your brain tells you, eat all the honeypot ants. The bad thing about evolution is evolution acts slowly. And so we have this sensory bias to really want to eat sweet things. And then we go to the grocery store and it's Halloween and there is an entire row of Halloween candy. We want to buy it and eat it because we have this sensory bias that makes us want to eat sweet things. And that gets us into trouble because we eat the hell out of sweet things and then we get obese and then we have health problems, et cetera, et cetera. But it's basically our hunter-gatherer brain, our hunter-gatherer sensory bias that hasn't yet caught up to what the modern mixture of food is. This is why you should not fat shame people. People eat sweet things because their brain is programmed to make them want to eat sweet things. That's why going on a diet requires discipline, is because your sensory biases are already pushing you towards eating things that normally would not cause you a problem if they weren't available in such high abundance in the current food mixture that we have available to us. So why do bread makers put high fructose corn syrup in bread when no homemade bread recipe calls for sugar being added to it for the most part? There are a couple of recipes that I have. My baguette recipe calls for a teaspoon of sugar in like 2.5 cups of flour, which is just a minuscule amount of sugar. Why is there high fructose corn syrup in modern bread at the supermarket?
To make it addictive.
It makes it sweet, it makes it taste good, it makes you want to eat more of it. Go and look at the nutrition labels, the ingredient labels on most of your food, and you're going to find sugar in some form in there. And oftentimes that sugar form is high fructose corn syrup. Why did high fructose corn syrup come about? Well, high fructose corn syrup came about because we had all this corn laying around and we needed to have something to do with it. Supply created its own demand. And one of the ways of creating that demand was now there's a demand for high fructose corn syrup. Most of your sodas now, your Cokes and Dr. Peppers and Pepsis and things like that, they're sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. They used to be sweetened with cane sugar. Why do we not sweeten things with cane sugar any longer? There's actually a Dr. Pepper plant in Texas, in North Texas, south of Dallas, that still makes Dr. Pepper that is made with cane sugar. And people will drive hundreds of miles to buy Dr. Pepper made with cane sugar. But most Dr. Pepper has high fructose corn syrup in it. Why in the 1960s was cane sugar in Coca-Cola and Coca-Cola in the 1980s and 90s and aughts and now is sweetened with high fructose corn syrup?
It's cheaper.
It's cheaper. And it's cheaper for a variety of reasons. Thank you. That was Mary, right? It's cheaper for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is growing sugarcane is labor intensive, and extracting sugar from sugarcane takes a lot of processing. And also there's not a huge subsidy for sugar, for cane sugar. There is a huge subsidy for corn. So you have a lot of corn being produced. As a result, that corn is really cheap to buy. And if you've discovered a way of converting that corn into high fructose corn syrup, then you can probably produce that high fructose corn syrup much cheaper than you can produce sugarcane-based sugar. And as a result, this has been the thing that we use to sweeten most of our foods with. Other examples of Say's law is using corn to create ethanol to blend into gasoline, using corn to make plastics. So the modern soda is amazing because there's corn syrup. Most of the volume of the non-water that is in your Coca-Cola that you drink, that's mostly high fructose corn syrup. And then it's typically bottled in a bottle that is probably also derived from corn. So food scientists and material scientists have taken this super abundant product, corn, super abundant commodity, and they have figured out ways of refining it and converting it into all kinds of things. It's in the ceramics that are in spark plugs. It's in all of my entire office is made up of gypsum board. The paper backing that is on gypsum board, that is glued to the gypsum part of gypsum board with glues derived from corn. The glues that hold together the processed pieces parts of chicken nugget, those food-based adhesives are all derived from corn. I have a whole sheet of products that are derived from corn. And it's truly amazing all of the different uses that corn has been put into. But all of those uses are just the application of Say's law. There's this super abundant resource. As a result, that superabundant resource is cheap. And when it becomes so superabundant and so cheap, people will find other uses for it. Say's law, supply creates its own demand. And so now you have corn being one of the biggest crops in the United States because it's used in our food supply, but it's also used in all of these other manufacturing streams. And it's used in our food supply in ways that in the 1960s, 50s, 40s, 30s, it wasn't used in our food supply. Poland also talks about this, although I don't think he talks about it in terms of Say's law, but the rise of grain alcohol distilleries during Prohibition. One of the reasons that people were making grain alcohol back then was recall that agricultural productivity was rising, exports to Europe were going down. They had a surplus back in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. And one of the ways that farmers could once again take that cheap corn that they couldn't sell very well on markets where corn prices were plummeting because you had too much supply and not enough demand, one of the ways that they could put that corn to good use was to convert it into grain alcohol. And then after alcohol was prohibited, then that grain alcohol just became more valuable. And so a lot of our surplus corn productivity during that time period was actually shifted into alcohol, not for blending in with gasoline, but for just human consumption during a time when alcohol was illegal. So humans have always found alternative uses for things that are in great supply and as a result are very cheap. With advances in technology and chemistry and material sciences, we are just much more clever about that now than we used to be able to be. And that is that. Questions? As I was making out the review sheet, there is a ton of information that we've been through since the last exam. Now, it's not a bunch of sciencey stuff, but it's a bunch of history and economics. And so the review sheet is over a page and a half of stuff to think about. So don't lull yourselves into a false sense of security. Oh, thank God there's not hardly any science on this test, but there's still a ton of information out there. My advice for studying to this test is to try and put all of this information into a timeline. When did things happen? What were those things that happened? How were those things related to agriculture? When, during that timeline, do I need to be thinking about economics, which is, quite frankly, most of the time. So it's not going to be just a recounting of, this happened then, this happened then, this happened then. It's going to be what happened, when did it happen, what did it mean for agriculture and society as a whole. And I think if you go and look at the old example of an exam 3 on the Moodle site, you're going to see that it isn't just a bunch of events and dates. I'm asking you to put on your critical thinking caps and think through what these episodes in 20th century history meant for agriculture, for the economics of agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that we've done during this test period is we've talked about the GMO report. So don't forget about that. I almost did when I made out the review sheet, but expect some questions about the National Academy of Science report. In most cases, these are probably going to be questions where I'm going to give you a graph and I'm going to ask you some questions about the graph. And so be able to interpret those graphs within the context of what you learned from seeing one another's presentations on the GMO report and also your own reading of that report. I believe all of the videos are up to date on the YouTube site. I checked them last night and uploaded the ones that hadn't been uploaded yet. So I think that's complete. If you see a date that's not on there, drop me an email and I'll try and see what happened to it. There are sometimes when I upload to YouTube and it doesn't take, and I log on later and it shows that the file has been deleted for some reason. But if there's something that you think should be up there that's not up there, let me know. Other questions? You guys are really quiet today. What's up? Tired? What's making you most tired?
Just not having a break.
Fall break is taking its toll, isn't it? Or the lack of a fall break is taking its toll, isn't it? Yeah. What else?
Being in quarantine.
Who's that? Branson?
Jack.
Jackson.
Jackson. Yeah. So are you quarantining at home or in the dorm?
At home.
Okay.
So it makes it feel like you're on break. So you're kind of just cruising through everything. Like, yeah.
Harder waking up for class.
Yeah.
All right. Don't lose focus. I mean, it's hard. I recognize that it's hard, but that same discipline that you put towards other aspects of your life, you're going to have to muster that discipline for your academics as well. Yeah, it's difficult. I feel super fortunate that I'm allowed to come into work. One, because I have a whiteboard behind me, a 4x8 whiteboard. But then the other thing is, it gets me out of bed every morning. So, all right. Do you guys want to schedule a review time or not? I can't see anybody but Mary and Olivia, so I don't know what the rest of you are thinking with your faces. I'll do it if you want, but I won't do it if you don't.
I think I'm good, but if I do have like a specific question that I'm having trouble with, will I be able to email you about it?
Oh yeah, just like always. Yeah.
Okay.
All right then, unless I hear from you, I will assume I won't do that. But like I said, if you want something like that, let me know. Or if you're like Blake and you just have some isolated questions, feel free to either set up a Zoom call with me or drop by my office. I am here surprisingly often. All right, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you virtually on Friday taking a test.